Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host Rich Gear here as well. And Doug, we have a very I'm really excited about this the guest we have, James Perloff, who's the author of a book was very influential called Tornado in a Junkyard. And I'm really excited to talk with him tonight about various subjects. And James, if you want to take it away, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and what you'd like to maybe talk about tonight. It'd be great.
Sure. Well, I have been an alternative media writer since 1986 when I began writing for the New American Magazine. I primarily write on history and geopolitics, as I was saying to you guys before we started recording the interview. But, my background is I grew up in an agnostic home. We were not churchgoers. We didn't read the Bible or pray. We went to church on the rarest of occasions, but it was only for ulterior motives, some social reason, and nothing to
Yeah.
do with faith. And then I had kind of a troubled youth, and I sought some relief through the New Age movement in my 20s. This is back in the 1970s, and finally saw through that deception and found myself being drawn to Christ. Became a Christian in the early 1980s. This is not important that we go into the details on this, but 2017, I became Eastern Orthodox, having experienced some dissatisfaction with the evangelical churches that I was attending. But in the meantime, when I became a Christian, one thing that troubled me was the different explanations of life that evolutionary science was providing versus the Bible. In the Bible, we read about Adam and Eve. And when I was in the sixth grade, my teacher taught us that evolution had disproven the Bible. And even though I wasn't brought up in a Christian home, I wasn't really adverse to the Bible, but that was my first step towards becoming an atheist. And then when I finally became a Christian, this question rose again because when I was a youth, my mother had a friend who bought me an annual subscription to National Geographic, and they would always have pictures of Louis Leakey or somebody like that examining Australopithecines, and this is supposed to be our hominid ancestor from millions of years ago. So even after becoming a Christian, I had this nagging question of, well, is the so-called science about this right? Is Darwin right, or is the Bible right? And I did hear a guy give sort of a modest presentation on Christian radio about this, and I said, well, there's some evidence in favor of the Bible. But then I read in the 1990s, I read What is Creation Science by Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Gary Parker, and that just blew me away. And I saw that Darwin's theory of evolution was a house of cards, and there was in fact a very weak house of cards. And as I continued to study, I felt, I read these great books like Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box
Yeah, very
and
good.
Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution by Lee Spetner, which made incredibly important points that discredited Darwin. But I also found that these books were probably really not that digestible for the average layman. And I wanted to write something that would reach out to the average Joe because so many people were being turned, myself included, being turned to atheism by Darwinism, which, by the way, was Darwin's intent. In 1873,
Absolutely.
he stated that his work was a slow and silent side attack in the Bible. He said, you can't attack the Bible directly. You couldn't do that in Victorian England, but you could. People respected science. So he just presented a science theory, you sort of scientific, that this is how life really began. People would just make up their own mind that the Bible was not true. And he was very successful at that. So I wrote Tornado in a Junkyard that came out in 1999 and was carried by the Conservative Book Club and Answers in Genesis and the Major Creation organization. But then somebody wrote to me and they said, I'd like 40 copies of Tornado and Junkyard to give to school board members. And I thought, well, this book is 350 pages long that I can read that.
Yeah.
So I said, I need a short book. So I wrote a book in 2002 called The Case Against Darwin, which is just
Oh, okay.
breaks it down to the most basic principles. You can read it in an hour. Another development for me was a creation scientist named Bryce Gaudian invited me out to Minnesota not long after I created these books, and I saw a presentation by Kent Hovind. I know that he's considered controversial by some in creation science, but I was very impressed by his integrity. This is the first time I'd actually seen a PowerPoint presentation. I said, wow, it's so much
Yeah.
better than just talking, having images there and maybe even videos makes all the difference. So I developed my own PowerPoint presentation on creation evolution as well as other subjects. And that's what I've used over the years. I've spoken to many youth groups and church groups using PowerPoint. And, when I give a PowerPoint, I'll kind of watch what makes people sleep and what keeps people awake. And so I kind of drop the parts that make people sleep or at least improve them. And in 2023, I put up maybe you can link to it in your show notes. I don't know. It's on the Rubble channel. It's a PowerPoint designed especially for the internet. My most up-to-date presentation on that because we are in a visual age now. People like to see. They don't like to read books that much. They like to see something in video format. So it's me narrating through slides, and I cover, the basic importance of evolution, which is that it discredited people's faith, made them think there was no creator, that we came about by chance, which does away with the Ten Commandments and creates a horrible kind of society we see today in so many respects. After establishing the importance of evolution on people's mindset and morals, I then go into many of the proofs against evolution. The video only lasts 38 minutes. I just try to concentrate on the most important points. The impossibility of life beginning itself. That's really where to start. Nobody's ever observed life start by itself. Sir Francis Crick estimated the odds of getting one protein by chance out of the thousands of proteins a single-celled bacterium would need. It's 1 in 10 to the power of 260 was his estimate. And then you have the whole question of, well, if the first cell came about by chance, which was what Darwin said in Origin of the Species, before it died, this first cell would have had to develop the complete process of cellular reproduction, or there never would a second cell. You start to see how silly this theory is, but it's taught as subtle science, and the important questions aren't asked in the classroom. And then there's other things like the lack of transitional forms, the deficits of the fossil record, which they try to claim, well, there's no transitional forms because it's all back in time. They all become extinct. You only find in the fossil record. The fossil record has deficits. And then there was the very important work of Lee Spetner in his book, Not by Chance, Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution. Now, he's a very advanced scholar, but he studied information theory and he proved
Yes.
that random mutations, which supposedly where natural selection acting on random mutations changes from a fish to a human, he demonstrated that mutations always cause losses of information. They don't cause a new function or a new organ. They always cause losses. So that's another place where the evolutionary theory falls dead. And then you've got Michael Behe with his irreducible complexity showing that things like vision and the immune system and the clotting system, these things could not have come about by evolutionary processes because they consist of multiple interdependent parts. One part by itself has no function. It has to be, the whole system has to be there from the beginning. So I kind of concentrate on those areas, and I also address some of the, in this 38-minute video, I concentrate on some of the arguments that evolutionists use, like the argument for microevolution. Do animals adapt to their environment? Well, they do. And, when we get a cold, we adapt to it by creating more white blood cells, and a fever, and we get a fever that bacteria can't survive that. Or I have a picture of Norwegian forest cats. They have these gigantic layers of fur because God's intelligent. Of course, he's a supreme intelligent being, and he knows that animals would have to adapt to different conditions. So he gave us smart cells, smart bodies that can adapt to conditions. But Darwin's mistake was thinking you can keep adapting until you change to a different kind of animal. But no, there's a limitation on adaptation. You can't adapt a fish all the way into a human being. So those are some of the things I cover in the 38-minute video. And I think, I don't get into a lot of esoteric areas, but I think there are basic arguments that the average person needs to know. And that's what I've always tried to concentrate on, because I think for evangelical purposes and bringing people back to faith in God, you need to concentrate on the basics. As I say in baseball, keep concentrating on the fundamentals.
I like it. Yeah. One thing that was influential that kind of piggybacked on top of Michael Behe's thing was I can't, my brain is blank right now, but he talked about not only irreducible complexity, but the complexity was specified. It was specific. There were things were designed for, they only worked in one capacity. They couldn't be adapted from one other thing to change into something else that could be used for
Right.
other things. I can't remember who, Doug, do you remember the author of that? Who
Yeah, that
come
would
up with
be
that?
Berlinski.
Yes, that's right. And that really, those two things to me really sealed the deal as far as I was concerned. You had irreducible and you had specified that not only was it irreducible, but it was only used for, many organs or many things are specified for its particular function. Not any, it really is not adaptable for anything you could possibly imagine. I
Right.
thought that was quite an interesting thing too as well. So that
One
book
of,
is what
one,
you go
one
ahead,
of
Doug.
the earliest things I wrote about was an article in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, 1977. It was called Interdependence in Macromolecule Synthesis and Evidence for Design. And it was about the fact that you needed DNA to produce messenger RNA, and it needed messenger RNA to produce um, proteins, and you needed proteins to form the DNA.
So
And
which
Right.
came
so you
first?
have cycle there that
Chicken or the egg. Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
depend, yeah. And so I wrote about that back then. So I remembered that being as a key component, especially when I was back in early college. I was trying to create life in the test tube and doing the origin of life experiments. And I didn't get far with that before I realized that the whole conditions for forming the peptide bond was not possible in an aqueous environment. And so I was part of that early group of creationists. I think I became a creationist about 1968 or 69.
Wow. Well, you really go back to you predated me by about 30 years. So well done on keeping up this fight for this length of time and for fighting for the truth that I guess it was Henry Morse's book on the flood, 1961, that
Yeah,
kind
Genesis
of
flood.
ignited the changeover and a lot of other explorations that have come since that really debunked Darwin. It's actually a terrible theory lacking scientific observations and with so many solid arguments against it. But unfortunately, in public school, the creationist arguments are shut out. They claim that you're trying to advance religion and that's against the Constitution, which it isn't. But they have succeeded in only telling students one side of the story. It's like being in a jury trial and you only hear the prosecution, you don't hear the defense, or only hearing the defense, you don't hear the prosecution. You need to hear both sides of the story. And I think when most people who are rational and open-minded hear both sides of the story, there's no question that creation wins by quite a few miles.
Well, the only way Darwinism wins is by stacking the deck. And in fact, it was interesting when we've done done shows on this in the Scopes monkey trial. That
Right,
Clarence Darrow, who argued for the evolution to be taught in the school, it was a put up job, by the way, by the ACLU back in the day.
right,
And the guy
correct.
never really even taught evolution, but he was willing to be the guinea pig. Scopes was, and
Scopes, John Scopes, yeah.
but Darrow's argument was it's the highest form of what, and I'm not probably misquoting it, but the idea, the basic gist of it was the highest form of inequity or I can't think of the word he used, but of unfairness, let's put it that way, to teach only one view of origins. But now the foot's the shoe's on the other foot.
Right,
Where does the unfairness come in? See, this is what I find out in so many things which are false. They're always talking about tolerance and forbearance and accessibility until they get to the ascendant worldview. Then they shut
right,
you out. It's all, I don't care whether you're a
exactly.
Muslim or whether you're an atheist or a secularist. They're always nice and oh, we're all wonderful until we get to the top. Then suddenly you can't speak. And Christians by
Right,
and large have been put to sleep a lot of times because we are forbearant and tolerant. We know that we are saved by grace, not by works. But that we sometimes use that as an excuse to basically be lazy in our thinking and to allow people to run roughshod over you, not to stand up for what you feel is what you know is correct,
Right.
and to basically develop a backbone instead of linguini spine. And this is what happens often, all too often. And so I've seen this in countless things, whether you're a left winger or an Islam guy, an atheist guy, a Darwinist guy. They always were narrow nice when they're in the minority. When they become the ascendant, they're not nice at all. They become very
Yeah.
intolerant. Yeah, it's unbelievable if you look at all of these across the board. Christianity is the only one that gives people not only a fair chance, but they raise them up to help them out. And then they basically, the old bite the hand that feeds you, so to speak. And that's what happened to the Christians, And we had the ascendant worldview. The Lord brought in the history, went out, and Christianity conquered the world in a sense, but even countries that didn't become
Right.
Christian became Christianized. You don't burn wives in effigy in India anymore because Britain went over there for a couple hundred years. You know what I'm saying? And there's just a lot of things that even though they never became Christian as a nation, there were things that became Christian in worldview as far as effects and things that happen. I have a friend. His name is Dr. Jerry Bergman. You may have heard about him.
Well, I've seen him on the CRS email network. Yeah.
Yeah, he was an atheist, but he got convinced because he started looking at all the things that seem to be beneficial to the human race, the humankind, and he said pretty much all of it started with Christian worldviews, whether it's universities, which have become paganized, whether it's medical associations with equal, opportunities in medicine, medical advancements, even the scientific theory, all of these based on a Christian worldview. It's not like we didn't have technology or information beforehand. We did, but it was the idea that you could build knowledge because there was a creator who was a reasonable, and the world, even though it was broken and fallen, you could still see the organizational skills of the creator God. And that Darwinism basically ignores all of that. Everything's random. They have to almost anthropomorphize random chance. They have to say, well, it decides that it's going to do this. Randomness by nature will not decide to do anything, you know. And when
Right.
that falls apart, they come up with alternate universes because no one's ever seen anything they said should be happening in ours. And well, we happen to be the one that got it right. There's no evidence for any of it. It's I they There's a lot of bait and switch going on in Darwinian thinking, evolutionary and atheistic thinking. They just don't want to, and it's because of the hardness of heart. And ultimately, it is a heart issue. It's a head issue, but the heart is dominated. The emotions allowed them to override real clear and crystal thinking on this thing. Antithetical reasoning is out the window on some of this stuff. You've seen it by your researches already. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, Rich, I want to give James a opportunity to talk about the subject that we were supposed to talk about tonight, and that has to do with the genealogical timelines that are
Oh,
mentioned
yeah.
in the
Okay.
Bible. And so I'm going to allow James to talk about that and to give his opinions on the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint and why that would be important in establishing the timeline.
Was attending a men's Bible study at a church well over 20 years ago. It was a good Bible study. I must have been in it for about 3 years, and I think we averaged about 8 to 12 guys per week, which is a pretty good number for a Bible study. And we would take turns leading the Bible study. But there's one thing that started to bother me a lot, and that was when Jesus and the apostles were quoting the Old Testament. We were trying to do a pretty deep search, and so we would turn to the Old Testament to the passage alluded to, and it would say something different than what Jesus and the apostles said in most cases. Not really radically different in most cases, but nonetheless was different. And it started to bother me. And so I asked the guys in my group, have you noticed this? Why is it that when Jesus and the apostles quote the Old Testament, you go to the Old Testament, it says something different? And one of the gentlemen in the group who was more schooled in the Bible than I was, he said, well, that's because there's two versions of the Old Testament. There's the Septuagint, which is what Jesus and the apostles were quoting, but there's also another version called the Masoretic text, which is what our Bible has. And so I accepted that. I said, okay, so there's two versions of the Old Testament. I really didn't question it much further. Over time, though, I started to hear some more questions being asked about this distinction. And actually, the reason I brought this up tonight, I wouldn't have done it if this hadn't happened. But about 2 months ago, a friend of mine, a writer in Switzerland, Patrick O'Carroll, sent a general email to his email list, and it was about the growing evidence of differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint history of all of that. And I said, this is such a good email, Patrick. Could you turn into a blog post for my website? He'd written one blog post before on the history of the Beatles and some of the forces that were hidden behind the scenes of the Beatles. It was a very popular post. Said, could you write a blog post? So he did, published about a couple of weeks ago. And I acted sort of as the editor on it. But this really got me interested in this subject, and it has bearing on creation science itself. So I think because a lot of our viewers won't be familiar with these terms, Septuagint, Masoretic text, we should just mention how these two different versions of the Old Testament originated. And you can interject anytime. But the Septuagint was the first version of the Old Testament. And according to tradition, what happened is Ptolemy II, who was the son of one of Alexander the Great's generals, he became the ruler of Egypt from starting in the year 285 BC, and he built the Great Library of Alexandria, where we would put many of the world's great books. And he learned about the Mosaic Law that had been read to the people, the Hebrews, by the prophet Ezra. And since Hebrew was disappearing as a language,
Mhm.
and most people were speaking now Greek or Aramaic, he wanted to have the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, or at least of the Pentateuch, to be translated into Greek. So according to the tradition, he hired 70 or 72 scholars from Jerusalem, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't being cheated, so he had them work in different isolated places so that they couldn't collude with each other. And he said, if you try to trick me, I'll know it. So they each wrote out a version of the books of Moses. And when they were done, he found that they matched each other. And so he was very happy, Ptolemy II, and he rewarded them with gifts, sent them back to Jerusalem, and he put these texts into the Library of Alexandria. And over the next century or so, because Greek was becoming more and more the substantial language used even by Hebrews, Judeans, the rest of the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and that became the Septuagint. And actually, in the Orthodox Church, we have the Orthodox Study Bible, which still preserves the Septuagint. That's what the Orthodox Church in the East has always used. Now, as far as the Masoretic text goes, it's interesting. I have a book which I read, I guess, about 6 years ago, Selected Writings of St. Justin Martyr. And Justin Martyr was a marvelous apologist for Christianity. He's a great scholar. He knew the Old Testament, the New Testament. He knew Greek mythology, and is a great debater. But one thing he observed, and he gives many examples of this in his, well, at least several examples, was that the rabbis were starting to change what the Old Testament said in the synagogues. And he gave some examples. Let me see, let me dig up a couple here. He found, for example, that in Deuteronomy 32:8, the rabbis changed, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of God's angels, to he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the children of Israel, which is sort of a nationalistic insertion. And actually, if you look at the Septuagint, it still has the original, but in the Masoretic, it has the change that Justin Martyr documented. One more example, and I'm just going to quote him directly. He wrote, quote, and from the 96th Psalm, they've taken away this short saying of the words of David from the wood. For when the passage said, tell ye among the nations the Lord has reigned from the wood, they have left out, tell ye among the nations the Lord has reigned. Now, the importance of taking out the wood was that the wood symbolized the cross, according to St. Justin Martyr. And this was one of a number of prophetic references in the original Septuagint that got taken out. And just to follow this through history, and then I'll throw it back to you guys. As you know, the church split in 1054 AD.
Right.
The Vatican split with Constantinople. Now, the Eastern Church in Constantinople kept the Septuagint, but um, in the West, in the Vatican, they were using the Latin Vulgate, which had been put together by Saint Jerome and was sort of a hybrid, if I understand it correctly, between the Septuagint and some of the older Hebrew texts. Now, of course, in the 1500s, you had the split between Martin Luther and the Reformers and the Catholic Church. In the meantime, the rabbis continued to translate, especially in the latter half of the first millennium, the Old Testament into what they call the Masoretic text, which they completed around 1000 AD, which is about, according to the timeline, about 1200 years after the Septuagint was begun. And I'm not sure of all the reasons why Martin Luther accepted the Masoretic text over the Latin Vulgate, but I suspect, I may be wrong, that some of his general ill feeling towards the Vatican may have influenced his decision to go with the Masoretic text, which was recommended to him by rabbis, as opposed to the Latin Vulgate. I'm not advocating one side or the other here. I'm neutral. I've never been a Roman Catholic, but I just have a feeling that that probably was part of it. So over the years, what happened was the Eastern Orthodox Church continued to use the Septuagint, but King James, Luther, Calvin, they all adopted the Masoretic text. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that's what we're using today. And I'd like to get into some of the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic, but let me throw it back to you guys because I may have prompted some remarks that you'd like to
Yeah,
make.
there's lot of things in there. I've read there's a guy who's he's in favor of the Septuagint, specifically the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11, the
Right.
Septuagint chronology. And we've talked about this on the show before. I remember originally years ago I threw the Septuagint out because apparently Moses outlived the flood by 14 years based on what we have. But the reality is
Was it Moses or
Jerome.
Shem? Moses or Shem?
I'm sorry.
No,
Oh, did I say? I
Methuselah.
meant Shem. No, no. I'm sorry. Methuselah outlived the flood by 14 years. Okay, which couldn't have been. But in the Masoretic, he dies in the year of the flood. Okay, but what happened is I did not know this. That was the main thing that was the death knell for me for the Septuagint version years ago. I've
Mm.
since now come around to the other side. Well, I'm more in favor of the Septuagint for the chronology at least, because Jerome, who did the Vulgate, and Augustine said, well, this is obviously a variant. And that gets to the crux of the issue of why some of them might have liked the Masoretic text, because there was a consistency for since the rabbinical tradition after the fall of Jerusalem, the second century AD, the tradition which developed into the Masoretic text in the 10th century, it was several hundred years, it was fairly consistent. But there was a reason for some of the changes they did. This is a guy named, and we've talked about this, his name is Henry B. Smith. He's a pretty guy, biblical archaeologist, but he's a creation guy. It's they did not want to have Jesus being a fulfillment of prophetic Hebrew
Right.
prophecies. Okay, so
Mm.
that's when they started. They used something called the Seder Olams, which is a Persian traditions, to shorten the timelines a little bit in the chronology. But according to Jerome and Augustine, there was a variant where they had the 187 for the birth of Lamech by Methuselah. So because by the flood you have a really tight, they're very close together. They're almost identical. But in the
Mm.
earlier part, the Septuagint's got 100 years more on every one of them, and it goes that way. And then the post-flood chronology, all the way down to Abraham. After the flood to Abraham, it's all again 100 years is added until they couldn't. Then like Abraham was 50 years because the lifespans had decreased by that point in time, which we
Right.
talked about. But the thing was, he said that what happened was they had something called messianochronology. I guess a thing today would be the evangelical. Somebody says, "Well, we're in the seventh millennium. This will be the day of rest. This is when the Lord's going to return. It'll be the 1,000-year millennial." I mean, it's just extra biblical nonsense. But the point of it is, they had this. It was apparently a very strong theory back in the day, and And Jesus unfortunately fell right when the when their messianic chronology said the Messiah was supposed to come, and they couldn't have that. So they down. He believes they actually purposely did that to knock it down, to get so that he would not have been able to be the fulfillment of those speculations. Those are all extra biblical things, but that there had to be a reason for why, because the Masoretic text. That's why people took it. The Luther, those guys, because there was a strong consistency with the Septuagint, because there was no authoritative body. You do get variance from one country or region to another. There's sometimes lines get dropped and things. There's some very, you can get to the real things without too much difficulty, but there are certain variants. And then you got to say, well, if did they add 100 years? And that's the other line that they used to say. Well, the Septuagint added 100 years to make that they were in Egypt. So they're trying to match the Egyptian long ages for their. It's kind of like what they call. Europe is very much more familiar with it than we are. The idea that older your civilization is, the more street cred you have. You know what I mean? So Babylon was more important than Egypt. Egypt is more important than Assyria. Assyria is more important than Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but not Babel. That's the most. So China had ending eons. But I said to myself years ago, I said, well, why did they only add 100 years? And why did they add 1,000 years? You know, I mean, it made no sense to me. So that was not a big argument for my thing. The idea that Methuselah would have outlived the flood by 14 years, that was a deal killer. Till I realized, oh my gosh, that was a variant, and numbers that can happen from time to time. That's why I believe the reformers choose the Masoretic, because it was consistent for 10 centuries or 8, 9 centuries. Their changes had been codified, but the problem is, sorry, it's like why there was a Reformation, Yeah, you got the Pope up at the top, and if he's a good guy, well, then all the righteousness trickles down. But if bad doctrine comes in, I call it the Pope becomes the poop. Fecal matter trickles down for all the way down through the whole system, and that's what he believes happened with the Masoretic in certain instances. And I looked at that because I saw one scripture that really got to me, where it talks about Hebrews. Sacrifice and offering you've not required of me, but a body you've prepared. And in the Old Testament, the Masoretic says, "Sacrifice and offering you've not required of me." But what something they changed it very something about. But you're right. I can't. But it totally was different. I thought, could these words mean the same? This was years ago when I was studying this. So
Yeah, they replaced it with "My ears you have opened,"
my ears you've
and
opened. That's what it was.
they removed the "A
Yeah.
body you've prepared for me," which
So
was a
that was
prophetic.
changed. But then I asked
Yeah,
myself, but then why did they keep Isaiah chapter 53 and Psalm 22, which are definitely messianic? They didn't change those. Those were
right.
kept. So I think sometimes, but he also, Henry B. Smith brought something out that was very, very good. The timeline, if it's expanded, it doesn't help long agers very much at all. Because instead of 4046 BC, which is Usher, well, Usher's 4004, but the modern people are 4046 seems to be more consistent. It would be more like 5200 BC. Okay, so that doesn't help long
5326.
ages at all. But you add an extra 1,000 years approximately, and you have a much more realistic timeline for how these civilizations got developed in the time of Abraham. You also have
Right.
a separation between Noah and Abraham by a lot more than 50 years. He would have died like 50 years before Abraham was born. He would have been dead like 800, 900 years earlier. So my point of it is, this made more. I mean, because years ago I thought about, boy, these civilizations. Yeah, Answers in Genesis does a good job in showing how populations could go, but the development of the civilization seemed to be quite developed in pretty far away distances,
Right.
and that always troubled me. And when he talked about that there was a variant that they had, and we don't have it anymore. We only have the 167 for Methuselah now, but it's really 187. It has to be, otherwise, and he would have died the year of the flood. But other than that, it's interesting because the Masoretic, except for that 167 variant, but the 187, from Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, and Shem, they're identical. They're virtually identical. There's one variant and another one, but that one's a number I think changed. But then everything else, 100 years longer in the Septuagint, and 100 years down after the flood, 100 years until you get the time of Abraham. They couldn't. He believes they couldn't take off 100 years. It was too much. But his final coup de grace for me was when the Masoretic text leaves in Abraham lived to be 175 years of age, an old man full of years. Well, on the surface to us, that sounds, yeah, well, that's okay, he's an old man. But if the Masoretic text is correct, you still have 300 and 400 year and even 600-year-old people still alive. In fact, some of the
Right.
Jewish tradition thinks that Shem was Melchizedek, which I don't believe he was, but that's a Jewish, Kabbalah,
Mhm.
probably, one of those traditions. But so there are those things that I have come to conclusions that I think that the Masoretic, in a lot of respects, is very good because there is a consistency there. But the changes were there because they had a high regard for Scripture, the rabbinical tradition, and then which morphed into the Masoretic, that part of it, and that's by the 10th century. That's how we got that. But you look at. I said, well, wait, we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. What is that? We don't have the chronology from Genesis 5. We have got parts of Genesis, but we don't have the chronology. But there are several other older traditions. They're extra biblical, and the only thing that matches is the longer timeline. The shorter one does not work at all. Okay, so
Right.
but then the other thing was they said they're trying to match the Egyptian, timeline and chronologies for their own to give them a little bit more. But there seems to be a lot of evidence in the Septuagint version. They were actually using the original Vorlage, is what they call it, the original Hebrew, to make their translations. They were not using extra biblical things or trying to make things up. They were using the original source material. And so those are the reasons, at least chronologically speaking. The issue comes in is whether you believe there's that extra Canaan which Luke mentions, but in the Masoretic it's not in there, but it's in there. It's in the Septuagint um, version of it, the extra Canaan in there, and that adds 130 years onto the chronology as well. I think I put that in pink in my outline here. I could send it to you if you're interested in it, but because I also have differences when I come down to the Persian thing. I tend to be more, even though I don't agree with some of the Martin Anstey things. I agree that the Ptolemaic system is too. It doesn't make sense. I have different articles about why there's at least three major scriptures that really cause a problem with the standard timeline in the Persian Empire. That's another thing. But I don't think it's Seder Olams are like 52 years to the Persian. No, it's about 123, 125 years for the Persian Empire, but the standard is 205. Those are quibbles maybe, but for the prophecy of Daniel to work, that's the only thing that makes any sense. But so that's why the last thing, and I'll let you talk some more, James, because I'm dominating, and Doug's going to kick me off in a second. Anyway, but is the idea? I love the idea that this was the version that the apostles used, and
Right.
that Jesus, they were using the Septuagint. So why do we think that's not a good version? You know,
Right.
and again, the reason why people do that is because there are we've had over centuries different variants that have come down because we didn't have one authoritative body. See, when the rabbinical tradition came in after the temple at the fall of Jerusalem in the second century, about 125, 150, they started coming up with this idea. They had this one translation and it went to all the synagogues, the same translation. That's an advantage if it's good. But if they make changes, then you got real problems. And
Right.
that's what Smith believes. And I think he's got some really good arguments here. I don't know what he thinks about the Persian time, but that's a whole different chronological issue. So but I think I can't get from Daniel 70 weeks to Jesus based on the standard timeline. I can't get there, especially when the
Mm.
Bible tells you clearly it's Cyrus who's going to do the decree. They have to tell you it's Darius or Artaxerxes or some other king, but Cyrus's decree is given, at least in part, in two books of the Bible. The other ones are not given at all. So, and it tells you this is the man who's going to restore and rebuild my city, Cyrus. And after
Mhm.
him, there's only going to be four Persian kings. Ptolemy's got 10. So I think, well, maybe are some of these kings the same, just a title? Yep. Artaxerxes is a title, not actually a name. Okay. And then they put different variants. Are they nicknames? So I come up with speculation on that one, but which is unarguably, or arguably not. I'm not saying it's the answer to it, but I can't get 205 years in the Persian time. But
Yeah, I
but
have the comparison. I have the comparison in my book. Don't let your geology mess up your theology.
yeah,
And if you like, I can share that, but I want to let James speak first.
go for it, Jim. I was giving you had to give us some reason, so I'm done.
Well, I was going to first talk about distinctions between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, but you've already gotten into timelines, and I was going to kind of bring this up at the end. but I'm going to do it now because I think we only have. When you look at the Masoretic text, the flood, and I think that is generally agreed upon by creation scientists using the King James. The flood would have taken place about 2348 BC.
Hmm.
And one of the problems is when you ask archaeologists when the first civilizations occurred, they will say, well, Mesopotamia about 3100 BC. And you ask them, when did the pharaohs start to reign? And they will say, well, about 3100 BC. And well, whenever I heard that before, I would always say, well, that can't be true because it contradicts the scripture and the scriptures have to be senior. But the problem is, in the Septuagint, which the Orthodox Church has used from the beginning, its timeline, which you've already mentioned, its timeline puts the flood at 3360 BC. Now that gives you 260 years between the flood and the rise of the pharaohs in Mesopotamia. And that's enough time to start civilizations going. So when you use the Septuagint, you don't run into this conflict with archaeology. And I kind of like that because we don't have to disrespect the archaeologists and they won't disrespect us saying that, well, our findings, not to say that there aren't a lot of mistakes within um, scientific analysis and
Yeah,
anthropology and things like that. But it puts us in alignment with archaeology, and that's one of the things I do like about the Septuagint. And there are, like I say, some contradictions between it and the Masoretic I'd like to get into if we have time. But that's kind of just to pick up on what you were saying about timelines. That I think is, to me, what stood out the most was that the Septuagint gives us a timeline for the Great Flood that does not contradict the archaeology.
I
yeah,
have
which really points
I'll
to
share
the
my screen here, and we can you can see the timeline that we have in the book. And like you said, the timeline here of the flood in Richard's chronology here is 3070 BC in the Septuagint, whereas in the Masoretic is 2348 BC.
yeah,
And so what you have is differences in when the births of the of the patriarchs. They add 100 years in quite a number of the cases.
Right,
So in this particular case down here, Arphaxad was 35 when Selah was born, but in the Septuagint, Arphaxad was 135 when Canaan
right.
was born. And so uh, we have those differences uh, in the Septuagint versus the Masoretic. Now I'll stop the share, but I'll have you comment on those differences.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I am
yeah,
asking you. Yeah, what
yeah.
you think?
Oh, well, you've put more study in this than I have. I know that in Patrick O'Connell, who wrote my guest post for my website, his research indicated that the Septuagint put the flood at 3360 BC, which is a
Right,
little
about
different
300
than the
years earlier
figure
than
you
mine
just
does. Yeah,
the figure that you just gave me. So this is something I haven't personally researched enough to have a strong opinion about. But I was impressed that the Septuagint was much more in alignment with archaeologists, what
absolutely.
they're saying, than the Masoretic text was.
And when you take a look at the evolution, the creation evolution question, both of these interpretations, which would be, we maybe be off by a thousand years or so in the differences. That doesn't help the evolutionist who wants to reconcile it with the Bible, because you're talking millions of years in evolution uh, versus what the Bible says in these two different timelines when you line up the genealogies. And
Yeah,
so,
Right.
they're even finding out they're revising certain things in Egyptology as well. A lot of that was based on I don't want to say necessarily an evolutionary idea, but there, like Egypt was like 4100 BC or something when they first started. That's way too early, way too early.
Mhm.
But they've
Right.
had to revise it a little bit because they found things that don't make any sense based on that kind of chronology, like the
Mm.
intermediate time. There's first and second intermediate, first, second, and third intermediate times where there's really no dynasties in there. But the problem is you've got the Hittites they're like separated by 500 years from Solomon's time, and you have no mention of them in any place in history. So there's like maybe not 500, but 300 years anyway, a long period of time. And suddenly they show up again, like fully developed civilization in the time of King Solomon, yet they're in the time of Abraham. In fact, Abraham buys a tomb from the sons of Het, which is where the Hittites come from. Okay, and so, but they weren't developed. But according to the standard Egyptology, the Hittites were about, they were there much earlier, way earlier, and it would have been before Abraham based on biblical chronology, whichever one you use, whether you use Masoretic or Septuagint. But yeah, so none of it helps evolutionary scenarios. I'll tell you that right now. But even historical stuff, they tried to long age it. They tried to stretch it backward farther. The Ice Age, the last one was
Interesting.
10,000 years ago, and those kinds of things.
Now
Yeah, I've heard some. Yeah.
you go into the radioisotope dating and all the different arguments for long ages and refute them in your book Tornado in a Junkyard. And so I also wanted to mention that you also had a chapter in your book concerning the Scopes trial and the inherit the wind and how it distorted that in particular uh, issue.
Shows
So
you the dishonesty of the evolutionist. Um, the movie and play Inherit the Wind completely misrepresented the trial almost by 180 degrees. Well, just one example off the top of my head. In the movie, you see William Jennings Bryan object when Clarence Darrow tries to introduce Darwin's books into the trial. But in real life, it was William Jennings Bryan who was defending the Bible during the trial. He was the one who introduced Darwin's books. They just changed everything to the opposite it
Yeah.
was. So it wasn't me who came up with this idea, but I amplified it. I took the movie script and I compared it to the trial transcript and showed case by case where they actually reversed things completely.
Well,
And
that's
the public
brilliant.
was deceived. They took the movie as history, which it was not. It didn't. They showed John Scopes in jail, and a lynch mob comes for him.
Yeah.
Well, he was never in jail. It wasn't even an imprisonable offense. All these things were just made up by Hollywood.
Yeah, you had that. You had that in your book, or is that in
Oh
the book?
yes,
Or
yes, that's a chapter of my book. It's also my website. Um,
it was since I read
um,
that book. I
it's
got to go back and
called
look.
Hollywood. That I wrote a chapter, a blog post called Hollywood on Trial, but it's a chapter also in Tornado in a Junkyard. And I just thought that that had that movie, which is nominated for Academy Awards, had
Yeah,
so much influence on public opinion what happened, and it was a complete
it did.
misperception that the movie created.
Uh, yep. Well, the world knows how to promote evil and error very well.
Yes,
You know,
I'm doing it more and more all the time as we
absolutely,
move forward.
absolutely true. So, did you want to get into some of those differences, or do we have time for that, Doug?
we have about 8 minutes.
Oh, yeah, we got time. Did you want to go
Well,
into
eight
some of those
minutes.
subjects?
Okay. All
I'd
right.
love to hear
Well,
some of those.
one of the things that really struck me in reading the Bible before was the book of Esther is the one book of the Bible that never mentions God. And and then I found in Septuagint it has 100 additional verses and it mentions God and prayer a lot. Let me just turn to some passages that I happen to just pick out. And Mordecai said to Esther, call upon the Lord and speak to the king concerning us. And this is a prayer of Mordecai. I'll just read it. It says, he then beseeched the Lord, remembering all the works of the Lord, and said, O Lord, Lord, Almighty King, all things are under your power. There's no one to oppose you in your desire to save Israel, for you have made heaven and earth and every wondrous thing under heaven. You are the Lord of all. There is no one who shall resist you, Lord. You know all things. You know, Lord, that it is not out of disrespect or arrogance that I did this, that I refused to bow down before Haman. For I would have been happy to kiss the soles of his feet for the salvation of Israel. For I did this in order that I may not place the glory of man above the glory of God. I will not bow down to anyone but you, my Lord. Well, that's not in the Masoretic text. And I guess you can try to argue that it was added later, but I was impressed that this was in the Septuagint, and that in the book of Esther in Septuagint is not missing God. Um, there's also controversy with Job, chapter 2. It leaves in his wife saying to him, "Do you hold fast your integrity, curse God, and die?" But actually, they cut out in Job 2, verses 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, and part of 9 and 15. There's a lot more that was said. But what particularly bothers me, there's about almost 300 New Testament verses that quote the Old Testament, and 90% of them are quoting the Septuagint. In fact, somebody cataloged the Apostle Paul's references to the Old Testament, and 51 times he refers to the Septuagint, only 4 times to the Masoretic. And who but Paul would know better? Um, we have, for example, um, in Septuagint, Deuteronomy 32:43 says, "Rejoice, ye heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice, ye Gentiles." But the Masoretic says, "Rejoice, O you nations, with his people who will avenge the blood of his servants." There's nothing about the angels of God worshiping, which would be Christ, and or "Rejoice, ye Gentiles," which we know the Gentiles, and we know from the writings of Paul that the gospel is for Greek and Hebrew alike. But it appears the rabbis wanted to cut out the reference to the Gentiles. So in the Septuagint version of Isaiah 42:4, it says, "In his name shall the Gentiles trust," but the Masoretic text says, "And the isles shall wait for his name." Completely different. And the Septuagint version of Isaiah 51:5 says, "On my arm shall the Gentiles trust." But the Masoretic text changed it to, "In my arm shall judge the people." Nothing about the Gentiles trusting in God, which is fulfilled in the New Testament. And then the Apostle Paul in Hebrews 10:5, 6 references the Septuagint version of Psalm 47, which is actually in the Masoretic, it's Psalm 46. But it says, oh, this is one you already did. It's where you have a body prepared for me. You did this one already. But then in the Septuagint, the Book of Wisdom, which is still part of the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, it was thrown out by um, the rabbis and by Luther, but it forecasts Jesus. You might remember in Luke 2, he went. He was discovered by his family to be missing when they were returning from Jerusalem. Went back to the temple, and Luke says, "Quote: When they did not find him, went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to him, and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding his answers." What the Book of Wisdom predicts is, it says, "Quote: I shall have glory among the multitudes and honor in the presence of the elders. I shall be found keen in judgment. In the sight of the rulers, I shall be admired." I get just one more. It's from Luke 4:18. It quotes the Septuagint version of Isaiah 61:1 to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. And that's exactly what Isaiah 61:1 says in the Septuagint. But the Masoretic version, it says no mention of recovering the sight of the blind, because apparently the rabbis, uh, this is again documented by St. Justin Martyr, who lived from 100 to 165 AD, not that long
Yeah.
after Christ. They were trying to make their text eliminate the miracles of Christ, so that the people of Judaism who were converting to Christianity would slow down. They wanted to slow down that process by making the Septuagint look like it was less predicting the miracles and the divinity of Christ and the reconciliation with the Gentiles. So those are just some examples that I wanted to give. But the main thing I wanted to get to was one we've already covered, which is just the dating of the flood, which the Septuagint seems to be much more in line with. So I do have a lot of respect for the Septuagint, and I think that the Masoretic, if one of them was messed with, I think the Masoretic was messed with more. But I know that there are differing opinions on this, and I'm still
Yeah.
studying it, so I don't want to make it like, some affirmative dogmatic pronouncement.
No,
Well, a question
that's
I
fair.
might ask would be, is there really any doctrinal changes based upon this knowledge that we should make. I don't,
Um,
I don't think there's a lot of things that we can
well,
change.
it waters down the doctrinal idea of Jesus being the Messiah. But Patrick, in his article, and he did the research I didn't, but he said there was a tradition among the ancient Judeans that the Messiah would come 6,000 years after creation, or approximately. And
That
this
was
is
a,
one reason why the rabbis wanted to shorten the Masoretic text, was to take away the possibility that Jesus had come within the right time frame.
that's what I mentioned earlier.
So that is sort of a doctrinal change. If Jesus is not the Messiah, I would consider that to be a major doctrinal change.
Mm. Yes, I think that's probably the whole point of this discussion is that
Mhm.
if the Masoretic text, you take the for its word and you try to reconcile that particular prediction, it would be a problem. So I think
Or
that
what they might say, Doug, is that, well, that's an extra biblical prediction, which it is, but it was very much strong in the first century BC to second century AD. That's so what you said there, James, is exactly what I was alluding to earlier about shortening. They actually shortened it up so that Christ would not be the one who fulfilled that extra biblical
Right,
prophecy, yet he did fulfill it, despite that fact. It's not in the canon of scripture, for instance, but he came exactly when their extra biblical prophecies said he was supposed to come, and they couldn't have that. So that's why they
right,
changed. That's
exactly.
why I
Yeah.
believe they shortened it.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
Well, I guess
yeah,
we'll come up on the end of the timeline. Is that
yeah.
correct for
yes,
the
I
show?
think that we are close to ending our show, but we appreciate you coming on Revolution Against Evolution. Thank you for
Well, thank you for
joining.
having me on. And that's a great title, by the way. Great name for the show. Um, we need a few revolutions of the right kind taking place in
Yeah.
our culture right now.
Amen.
Yeah, it's the title of my book that was first wrote in 1986, and now it's in its fifth edition. So, but
Well,
this is we've been doing this since 1993, and so we've
Oh,
had over 1,000 episodes.
well, that predates that's about when I started looking into creation evolution. It certainly predates my book Tornado and Junkyard by 6 years. So you guys have really been at it. Thank you very much for your consistent work on behalf of God.
well, thank you, James. It's been great. It's been a joy interviewing you. It's been wonderful. Yeah.
Well, we'll
Thank
see
you.
you next time on Revolution Against Evolution. Thanks for joining us.